It begins in silence, not the silence of absence, but of something hidden, something waiting to be rediscovered. Long after the temples of Teotihuacan crumbled, after the last drumbeat of the Maya faded into jungle mist, and long after the ships of Cortez tore the horizon, a whisper endured. It passed through generations, unnoticed, not in parchment or glyph, not carved into obsidian or cast in gold. It survived where no conqueror looked, in the marrow of the people. Mexican DNA is not a traceable line, from point A to point B. It is a constellation. Each chromosome carries an echo from a world once vast and unknowable. For centuries, the true story of Mexico was clouded by myths of one people, one origin, one shared fate. But this was never the truth. It was just the loudest version. Modern science has torn open the silence. Through the work of thousands of geneticists, anthropologists, and historians, we now know the genome of the Mexican people holds more diversity than the landscape they walk on. It remembers things that even history books dared not record. The DNA doesn't lie. It remembers who fled, who stayed, who fought, and who was silenced. It remembers a people who were never one people. Over 60 indigenous civilizations, each with languages, gods, and bloodlines of their own, left genetic signatures as distinct from each other as a Frenchman from a Han Chinese. Think about that. The Seri of the northern coast share less genetic material with the Maya of the south than most Europeans do with each other. This isn't a coincidence. It's a legacy of ancient migrations, of climate barriers, of rivers turned to borders and deserts that kept nations apart. A forgotten atlas, encoded into nucleotides. The genome speaks of timelines untouched by colonial clocks. Some indigenous groups diverged over 11,000 years ago, long before the Inca built Machu Picchu or a single pyramid rose along the Nile. The DNA stretches back to the first people who crossed the Bering Strait, settled this land, and birthed civilizations from salt flats and volcanic valleys. But the story didn't pause there. It never does. In the 1500s, everything changed. The arrival of the Spanish wasn't just a historical event. It was a biological rupture. New DNA poured into the land like fire across dry grass. Epidemics tore through indigenous populations. Cultures fell, but the blood adapted, survived, fused. The DNA reshaped itself, but it didn't forget. And now, as we extract these stories strand by strand, we confront a haunting truth. What we call Mexican is not one thing. It's a web of memories, a fusion of resistance and absorption, a whisper carried for 1,000 years, now growing louder with every test tube, every genome mapped, every person who asks the question, where did I come from really? Because in the bones, in the blood, in the breath, it's all still there, waiting to be heard. What does it mean to belong to a place that never belonged to one people? Mexico, today a single nation, was never meant to be a single story. It's a land layered in contradiction. Its borders are drawn in law, but its ancestry is drawn in centuries. And those centuries tell us something that schoolbooks rarely do. The Mexican identity is a mask stitched from 1,000 forgotten faces. For most of the modern era, scientists, doctors, and even governments treated Mexicans as if they were genetically the same, as if a single category could capture millions of lived realities. Mestizo, a word that made complexity simple. Too simple. That word erased the colors in the thread. But DNA? DNA refuses to lie. The human genome doesn't tolerate oversimplification. It remembers every migration, every union, every wound. In the past 2 decades, massive genomic studies have made one thing abundantly clear. Mexico is not genetically uniform. It never was. Beneath every street in Oaxaca, every market in Guadalajara, and every skyscraper in Monterrey lie the echoes of radically different histories. Each region holds a different ancestral balance. Each family, a different origin myth. In the Central Valleys, indigenous lineages run deep, unchallenged for thousands of years, only brushed by colonial touch. Move north, and the pattern tilts. European DNA becomes dominant, a genetic shadow of settlers and soldiers. Travel to Guerrero, and an unexpected chord emerges. East Asian ancestry, subtle but unmistakable, like a ghost ship buried beneath Pacific waves. Why were we told this? Because power simplifies. Empires require clean categories. But history, especially genetic history, is chaos. It flows like a river, splitting, rejoining, carving new paths when blocked. And Mexico's genetic river runs wild. The idea of the Mexican as a single entity was never scientific. It was political, a convenient myth to unify a post-revolutionary state. But in doing so, it buried the truth. A truth that only now, through the lens of DNA, is coming back to life. We are not all from the same root. We are the forest. This forest stretches across time and terrain, from desert canyons to jungle rivers. It holds languages still spoken, and others now only alive in the double helix. It carries the legacy of those who were never allowed to write their version of the past. There's power in knowing that, because when a person sees their genome laid bare, when they realize that their bloodline didn't begin in 1521, but in a Stone Age migration, in a sacred ritual, in a coastal village untouched by empire, it reclaims something deeper than pride. Identity not as invention, but as inheritance. So the next time someone asks, "What are you?" maybe the answer isn't Mexican. Maybe it's, "I am the echo of many who refuse to be forgotten." Long before the name Mexico was ever spoken, before the wheel turned in Mesoamerica, before a single god was carved into obsidian, people lived here. Not one tribe, not one culture, but dozens, separated by mountains, jungles, and time itself. And what they left behind wasn't just temples or stories carved in stone. They left a deeper imprint, buried inside the people who walk this land today. The oldest voices in Mexican DNA don't belong to colonial rulers or modern citizens. They belong to ancient travelers, whose footsteps reached this land as glaciers retreated and mammoths still roamed. They settled, scattered, survived, and over thousands of years, they became distinct nations. The Tarahumara in the north, the Maya in the southeast, the Seri on the Sonoran coast, each one evolving in near isolation, their bloodlines growing more distant with every generation. Genetic studies have revealed something astonishing, something no history textbook ever dared to print. These indigenous groups are not just different in language or culture. They are genetically as distant from one another as Europeans are from East Asians. Think about that. Two indigenous communities inside the same country, and their ancestors last shared a common population nearly 12,000 years ago. This is not shared heritage. It's parallel civilization. This divergence is an abstract theory. It's written in the genomes of modern indigenous peoples. Researchers have mapped these lineages with surgical precision, showing us a pre-Columbian map that has nothing to do with borders and everything to do with survival. The Seri, for example, carry genes that drifted away from other native populations nearly 11,800 years ago. That's older than the first pyramid in Egypt. Even more remarkable, this immense genetic diversity wasn't lost when the Spanish arrived. It was buried. In modern Mestizo populations, the majority of Mexicans today, these ancient distinctions still echo beneath the surface. The DNA doesn't forget who came from where. A Mestizo in Yucatan often carries Mayan ancestry. One in Sonora might carry northern indigenous roots. You don't have to be fluent in Nahuatl or wear traditional dress to carry the blood of people who once built empires from obsidian and maize. What preserved these bloodlines wasn't isolation alone. It was resilience. These groups withstood climate shifts, famines, invasions, and extinction-level epidemics. And yet, their descendants are still here. Not just in remote villages, but in the genetic code of millions. Their stories weren't erased. They were encrypted. And now, we are finally learning to read that code. It's not about pride. It's about truth. It's about recognizing that Mexican history didn't begin in 1521, or even 1325 with the founding of Tenochtitlan. It began in the shadows of the Ice Age, written by people who had no kings, no maps, and no word for Mexico. Yet somehow, they laid the foundation for one of the most genetically diverse populations on Earth. This isn't ancestry. It's archaeology, conducted inside the double helix. And each discovery lifts another veil off the ancient face of this land. History remembers the conquest of Mexico in vivid detail, ships breaching the coast, steel clashing with obsidian, empires falling in fire and disease. But what most don't realize is that the real conquest didn't end at the battlefield. It etched itself deeper into flesh, into inheritance, into the very strands of DNA that now define a nation. When the Spaniards arrived in the early 16th century, they didn't just bring muskets and horses. They brought a biological upheaval that would echo across centuries. In just a few generations, entire populations vanished, not by sword, but by invisible invaders, smallpox, typhus, measles. These weren't just diseases, they were erasers, wiping out over 90% of some indigenous communities. And into the void, new bloodlines poured in. But conquest isn't only destruction, it's transformation. The Spanish didn't just take gold and land, they left behind their genomes. And the fusion that followed was not a peaceful blending. It was asymmetrical. It was power-coded into chromosomes. Today, we see the evidence in the split between paternal and maternal ancestry. Y chromosome studies show a heavy dominance of European male lineages. Yet when we examine mitochondrial DNA, the inheritance from mothers, the pattern reverses. Most Mexicans carry indigenous maternal ancestry. This isn't coincidence. It's the genetic signature of colonization, where Spanish men fathered children with indigenous women, often under coercion, leaving behind a lopsided legacy that still shapes identity. This pattern, repeated thousands of times across generations, became the blueprint for the Mestizo population, the backbone of modern Mexico. But don't mistake fusion for forgetting. The indigenous contribution wasn't swallowed whole. It survived, encoded, quietly resisting erasure. Even the European DNA tells a story of narrow origins. Genetic comparisons trace most of it directly to the Iberian Peninsula, specifically Spain. This precision reveals how concentrated the European influence truly was, how a relatively small wave of colonists could leave such a vast genetic imprint, thanks to systems of power, hierarchy, and forced integration. But it wasn't only the Spanish and the indigenous whose genes shaped this new world. The Atlantic slave trade brought thousands of Africans to New Spain. Their genetic legacy, though smaller in percentage, is just as essential. West African ancestry appears in every corner of the country, often silent, often forgotten, but undeniably present. It is the third strand in Mexico's genetic braid, too often left unnamed in the national narrative. So when we speak of the conquest, we must understand, it didn't just happen in cities or on maps. It happened in bodies. Every child born after 1521 became a battleground between worlds. And every generation since has carried that fusion forward, sometimes in silence, sometimes in pride, always in complexity. This isn't just a past to remember. It's a presence that breathes. In surnames that don't match skin tone. In traditions that blend the sacred with the colonial. In a genome that holds both the scars and the survival. Mexico's DNA is not merely a story of invasion. It is a story of adaptation under fire, of a people reshaped, but never erased. There are moments in history when entire identities are born, not through declaration, but through collision. In the centuries following the Spanish conquest, such a transformation unfolded across Mexico. It was not a revolution shouted in the streets. It was a quiet metamorphosis, unfolding in the blood of generations. Out of the ashes of collapsed indigenous empires and the rising grip of Spanish rule, a new population emerged. Not fully native, not fully European, but something in between. This was the genesis of the Mestizo, a name that once served as a category, but has since become the dominant identity of a nation. Yet even today, few understand what Mestizo really means. It's not just a label. It's not a fixed percentage. It is a living, breathing inheritance, formed from centuries of intermarriage, survival, and social reinvention. Genetic studies have revealed that Mestizos in Mexico carry, on average, between 50% to 70% indigenous ancestry and 30% to 50% European. But averages are deceiving. They blur the raw beauty of individual variation. Take two people, both born in Mexico City. One might carry genetic echoes of the Mixtec highlands, the other traces of Basque settlers. One might inherit markers from Yucatan's ancient Maya, the other from Iberian farmers who crossed the Atlantic in the 1700s. On paper, they're the same. In DNA, they are galaxies apart. What's even more fascinating is how this ancestral blend changes across geography. In northern Mexico, European contributions run deeper, reflections of colonial settlements and fewer surviving indigenous groups. But travel south, to places like Oaxaca or Chiapas, and you'll find DNA saturated with native lineages that have endured for millennia. This isn't randomness. It's the living map of Mexico's history, embedded in its people. The term mestizo has often been weaponized to include, to exclude, to define who belongs. But in truth, it tells a far more complex story. It's the result of forced unions, voluntary alliances, and everything in between. It holds both the cruelty of conquest and the creativity of cultural fusion. It is neither purely a symbol of unity nor solely one of trauma. It's both, simultaneously. And within this hybrid legacy lies something else: resilience. The mestizo population didn't erase what came before. It absorbed it. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but persistently. Across generations, language was lost, surnames changed, skin tones shifted, but the ancestral threads endured. Scientists can still trace specific regional indigenous ancestry in mestizo individuals, confirming that the genetic signatures of ancient tribes were never entirely drowned by colonization. This inheritance goes far beyond physical traits. It's in the food, the music, the rituals whispered over kitchen fires. It's in the way Nahuatl words still sneak into everyday Spanish, and how Catholic saints are celebrated with indigenous dances. Even when people no longer identify as indigenous, their ancestry continues to breathe through them. To be mestizo, then, is to carry contradiction. It is to be the product of both rupture and continuity. It is to inherit a story that begins in war but continues in life. And perhaps that's what makes the mestizo identity so powerful. It cannot be reduced. It refuses simplicity. It is built from complexity, and in that, it mirrors the land from which it was born. Not all migrations arrive with flags. Some arrive in silence, through the undercurrents of empire and trade, through chains and contracts, across oceans, with no return ticket. Their names were lost in port ledgers, their stories buried under colonial myths, but their traces remain, hidden in the DNA of modern Mexico. Beyond the known legacy of indigenous and European ancestry lies a deeper, quieter lineage, one that traveled across continents and centuries to leave faint but undeniable marks on the Mexican genome. And only in the last few years have we begun to uncover it. Let's start with Africa. Centuries ago, under the rule of the Spanish crown, ships crossed the Atlantic not just with silver and spices, but with human cargo. Enslaved Africans were brought to New Spain by the tens of thousands, forced into labor in ports, plantations, and cities. Their names rarely survived. Their languages were stripped, but their bloodlines endured. Today, every Mexican state, without exception, contains West African ancestry. Though small in percentage, often less than 5%, its presence is everywhere. In Veracruz, where the ships docked. In Oaxaca, where Afro-Mexican communities still dance to rhythms born on both sides of the ocean. Even in the highlands, where the only sign of their legacy is a single strand of DNA, carried unknowingly by someone whose skin tells a different story. Then there's the Pacific. Most Mexicans have never heard of the Manila galleons. Yet for 250 years, these ships sailed between the Philippines and Acapulco, weaving Asia into the fabric of New Spain. On board came goods, sailors, servants, and eventually genes. East Asian ancestry, once invisible, is now detectable through modern genomic tools. It peaks in Guerrero, reaching up to 2.3% in some communities. This isn't a rounding error. It's a historical footprint, left by those who never had a voice in textbooks. Some of these travelers were Filipinos conscripted into service. Others were Chinese merchants seeking escape from colonial rule. A few may have been enslaved themselves. Whatever their origin, they disappeared into Mexican society, nameless, recordless, absorbed. But their legacy persists in subtle physical traits, in shared vocabulary, and now in scientific confirmation. And just when the picture seems complete, another thread emerges from South Asia. Recent studies have revealed South Asian ancestry in Mexican populations, most strongly in coastal regions. It is rare, often less than 1%, but unmistakable. Its presence hints at Indian servants and migrants swept into the Spanish colonial system via Manila and other Pacific trade routes. These were not waves of migration. They were ripples. Yet even ripples leave lasting patterns when cast across generations. What makes these ancestries so powerful isn't just their novelty, it's their erasure. For centuries, Mexico's African and Asian contributors were pushed out of the national story. Their descendants grew up unaware of their full heritage, taught to view their identities through a binary lens, indigenous or Spanish. But science is rewriting that script. This isn't about rewriting guilt or assigning blame. It's about filling in the silence. It's about recognizing that identity is not what a nation tells you to be. It's what history insists you are. The genome has no loyalty to flags or empires. It only remembers. And now that we know how to listen, it's telling us the truth. Mexico is not a product of two continents. It is the child of five. It started with a question few dared to ask. What happens when a country looks inward? Not through the lens of politics or culture, but through its DNA. For centuries, Mexico's genetic story was told by outsiders. Generalized, simplified, misunderstood. But that era is over. In a quiet revolution led by its own scientists, Mexico has built a tool unlike anything it has ever had before, a nationwide genetic mirror. It's called the Mexican Biobank. This isn't just another database. It's a living archive of over 6,000 individuals drawn from nearly 900 localities across the entire country. Coastal villages, desert towns, mountain enclaves, and sprawling cities, all represented, each with over 1.8 million genetic markers, capturing a detail so fine it can distinguish between neighboring towns, between valleys and plateaus, between histories that textbooks collapsed into a single line. For the first time, Mexico isn't borrowing genetic models from European or North American populations. It's building its own, tailored, precise, grounded in the rich complexity of its own people. And what the data reveals is staggering. The biobank has confirmed what many suspected but couldn't prove. Mexico is genetically layered with locality-level precision. Not only do regions differ, but within those regions are echoes of pre-Columbian civilizations still traceable in modern genomes. The legacy of ancient tribes isn't buried. It's breathing. Alive in Mestizo DNA. Alive in urban neighborhoods. Alive in children who may never have heard the name of their ancestral community, but still carry its imprint in every cell. The project has also uncovered patterns invisible to history. It shows how indigenous ancestry, once thought diluted, remains resilient, even growing in some rural populations. It shows how genetic diversity clusters around old trade routes and settlement paths. And it proves that migration didn't erase identity. It simply reshaped it. But this isn't just about history. It's about medicine. By building a genetic resource rooted in its own people, Mexico is finally entering an era of precision healthcare. No longer dependent on data from foreign populations, researchers can now begin to understand how regional ancestry affects disease risk, medication response, and inherited conditions. Genes that influence asthma in the highlands of Chiapas may behave differently than those in urban Guadalajara. The same condition may require different treatment because the ancestry behind it is different. For a country long overlooked in global genomic research, this is nothing short of liberation. It's the start of a future where science is not imported, but homegrown. More than a scientific tool, the biobank is a political act. It says, we are not generic. We are not a footnote. We are specific, and we are worthy of study. And perhaps that's what makes this revolution so profound. It's not loud. It's not on the front page. But it's changing how a nation sees itself, cell by cell, village by village. For those who thought Mexican DNA had already told its story, the biobank responds with a quiet defiance. We've only just begun. Some inherit wealth. Others inherit names. But across Mexico, millions have inherited something far older, far more sacred, an invisible gift passed from mother to child across thousands of years. It lives in the mitochondria, a tiny structure in every human cell, passed down exclusively through the maternal line. While surnames vanish and empires fade, mitochondrial DNA remains almost untouched, silent, loyal, immortal. And in Mexico, this maternal legacy tells a story that no conqueror ever managed to erase. Modern genetic studies have exposed a powerful truth. Over 90% of mitochondrial lineages in Mexico today trace back to indigenous women, not colonizers, not foreigners, native women, whose bloodlines endured every chapter of destruction and still carry the rhythm of ancient civilizations. It's not a metaphor. It's literal biology. Each time a mother gave birth, she carried with her not only a child, but a whisper from the past. From generation to generation, these maternal lines have traveled through droughts, plagues, invasions, and revolutions, and they are still here. This continuity defies the violence of history. When Spanish colonization began, the devastation was swift and staggering. Cities burned, languages outlawed, cultures fractured. But deep within the body, indigenous identity found a hiding place. It chose survival in the bloodstream. Even today, the maternal line tells a more intimate truth than any census or church record. It reveals who bore the weight of colonization, who nursed children under foreign rule, who kept traditions alive in kitchens and lullabies long after public ceremonies were forbidden. These women didn't just carry culture. They carried ancestry. Science can now trace these maternal lineages with astonishing clarity. Haplogroups like A2, B2, C1, and D1 dominate the Mexican mitochondrial landscape, lineages that predate European contact by millennia. Their distribution varies from region to region, reflecting old migration routes and ancient communities. In the south and southeast, A2 flows strongest, echoing the legacy of Maya and Mix ancestors. In the north, C1 rises, a fingerprint of desert dwellers and highland hunters. These aren't just numbers on a chart. They're proof of presence, unbroken lines stretching back to women who once walked these lands when the stars still guided agriculture and gods lived in stone. And what makes this inheritance even more profound is that it persisted despite being marginalized. Colonization didn't just attempt to dominate. It tried to redefine identity. It pushed indigenous women to the margins of the social order, silenced their languages, renamed their children. But their DNA remained defiant. Their descendants may speak Spanish now. They may live in cities, wear modern clothes, work behind desks. But inside them, something ancient endures. A mother's code. A legacy that outlived conquest. This is not nostalgia. It's recognition. To understand who modern Mexicans are, we must understand who their mothers were. Not just the ones in recent memory, but the ones who stood barefoot in volcanic soil, who ground maize by moonlight, who buried their dead beneath carved stone and whispered to the gods of rain. In the end, conquest may have redrawn maps, but it failed to sever the maternal line. These women endured, quietly and completely. Their strength isn't only remembered, it is inherited. In every society, inequality has a face. In Mexico, it also has a genome. For generations, power and poverty have followed invisible lines, lines that don't just divide cities or classes, but ancestries. Beneath the surface of Mexico's rich cultural blend lies a stark biological divide, one that quietly echoes the shadows of colonization and continues to shape the lives of millions. The connection between genetic ancestry and social status isn't coincidence. It's consequence. Researchers have discovered that Mexicans with higher percentages of European ancestry are statistically more likely to live in wealthier neighborhoods, receive better health care, and access higher education. Meanwhile, those with stronger indigenous genetic roots are overrepresented in rural areas, often underserved, underfunded, and unheard. This isn't about biology defining worth. It's about history hardwiring inequality into the very structure of society. After colonization, systems were built, legal, economic, cultural, to elevate those who looked like the conquerors and marginalize those who didn't. These patterns didn't end with independence. They adapted. And today, genetic data reveals just how deep they run. But why does this matter now? Because the story we tell ourselves about being a mixed country often hides uncomfortable truths. The myth of equality through mestizage, that everyone is equally blended and therefore equally valued, is seductive. But it isn't real. The genome tells a different story. A layered one. A stratified one. Take two individuals with the same citizenship, same language, same flag. One has predominantly European DNA, the other mostly indigenous. Statistically, their life outcomes will differ, from employment opportunities to health risks. This is not about fate. It's about access. And access, in Mexico, still carries the weight of ancestry. Even in medicine, these divides persist. Genetic research has shown that certain indigenous lineages are less represented in global genomic studies, which means treatments, dosages, and diagnostics are often calibrated for someone else's body. When indigenous ancestry is overlooked in biomedical data, so are the people who carry it. But this story isn't just about injustice. It's also about revelation and the chance to do better. Now that the data exists, we have tools to identify these hidden gaps, to design healthcare that reflects all ancestries, not just the dominant ones. The rise of inclusive genomic databases in Mexico is not just a scientific achievement, it's a moral one. It recognizes that every lineage deserves to be visible, every background worthy of precision care. Education systems can evolve too. Knowing how deeply ancestry shapes regional outcomes can guide smarter policy, targeting areas not just by poverty levels, but by historical neglect. Because at its core, this is about recognition, not of victimhood, but of complexity. To heal inequality, we must understand its architecture. And DNA, for all its neutrality, has become one of the clearest maps we have. This is more than genetics. It's a confrontation with legacy. The past isn't just in our textbooks, it's in our traits, our lifespans, our access to opportunity. And only by facing it can we begin to rewrite the future. What if identity wasn't a flag, or a name, or a language? What if it was a question, unanswered, evolving, embedded deep inside the people themselves? Mexico, for all its colors and contradictions, has always been defined by reinvention. From the rise and fall of indigenous kingdoms to the chaos of revolution and the forging of modern nationalism, the Mexican identity has been rebuilt more times than history can count. But now, through the lens of genetic science, we're seeing something both ancient and entirely new. We're learning that the Mexican genome is not a blend. It's a continuum, a vast, shifting spectrum of ancestries that defies borders, binaries, and assumptions. There's no single origin, no pure type. Every person here is a walking archive, carrying fragments of migration, resistance, adaptation, and survival. And yet, for so long, identity was flattened into a convenient fiction. The idea that all Mexicans are mestizo. The myth that bloodlines mix so thoroughly, so evenly, that difference ceased to matter. But the truth, illuminated by genomics, is far more powerful. Difference not only remains, it defines. The diversity inside the Mexican population is staggering. Some carry lineages that go back 12,000 years, descendants of the earliest settlers who crossed land bridges and built stone cities before Europe ever saw a castle. Others hold DNA tied to enslaved ancestors ripped from African coastlines. Still others carry the genetic echoes of Asian migrants, Pacific traders, and forgotten laborers from South Asia. All of them are Mexican. So what does it mean, then, to belong? Maybe it means understanding that heritage isn't a costume worn on holidays. It's a living memory. It pulses under the skin. It sings in the lungs. It lingers in the silence between generations. And now, with each new genomic discovery, that silence is breaking. Science is giving voice to ancestors who were never written into the official narrative. It's uncovering migrations no historian recorded, restoring complexity where politics once demanded simplicity. And that has implications far beyond academia. It changes how we think about community, about inclusion, about who gets to speak and who gets heard. It forces us to confront the ways history shaped not just who we are, but how we see each other. It also offers healing. To learn that your DNA links you to ancient civilizations, forgotten by textbooks but alive in your genome, is to reclaim a truth larger than any single story. To discover that your ancestors survived displacement, disease, and erasure, and yet their genetic imprint remains, is to carry pride born not of nostalgia, but of continuity. Being Mexican today is not about fitting into a fixed definition. It's about embracing a legacy that refuses to be narrowed down. It is to live at the intersection of continents, cultures, and centuries. In this country, Every surname has a secret. Every face carries a map. Every cell contains a sentence from a story still unfolding. And so, we ask again, what does it mean to be Mexican now? It means being the answer to 1,000 forgotten questions, and the beginning of 1,000 more.